At a high-end restaurant run by a ruthless owner, people are treated differently based on their appearance. When a homeless man in tattered, worn-out clothes walks in, no one welcomes him, except for one person. A struggling black waitress, working tirelessly just to get by, is the only one who shows him kindness. But what she doesn't know is that this man is not who he appears to be. And by helping him, she's about to turn her entire world upside down. Before diving in, drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear them. In the heart of New York City, where towering skyscrapers cast long shadows over the streets below, stood the Grand Pearl, a restaurant renowned for its luxury, its exclusivity, and the kind of clientele who never had to check their bank balance before ordering. The air inside was thick with the aroma of gourmet dishes, the hum of polite conversation, and the quiet clinking of fine china against marble tables. It was a place where wealth spoke louder than words, where service was impeccable yet impersonal, and where the presence of a single out-of-place figure could shatter the illusion of perfection. Among the staff bustling about in crisp uniforms was Ammani Johnson, a young black woman with determined eyes and an unshakable spirit. At 25, she had already learned that the world didn't hand out kindness easily, especially not to people like her. Every day, she navigated the unspoken rules of this place, where the guests were treated like royalty while the employees were expected to be invisible. She was no stranger to long hours, aching feet, or the condescending sneers from both customers and management alike. But none of that mattered, not when there were bills to pay, and more importantly, a mother waiting at home, battling an illness that didn't care how many shifts Ammani had to take to afford her medication. Her boss, Marcus Blake, ruled the restaurant with an iron grip. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, his perfectly tailored suits and slicked-back hair gave him an air of importance, but his true nature lurked beneath the surface. Marcus was a man who believed in appearances above all else, who you were, how much you were worth, and, most importantly, whether or not you belonged. To him, his employees were nothing more than replaceable cogs in a machine, and his disdain for anyone who didn't fit his narrow mold of respectability was made clear in the way he spoke to them, the way he looked at them, the way he reminded them, subtly or otherwise, that they were beneath him. It was just another evening at the Grand Pearl when the routine was interrupted. The doors swung open, and a man stepped inside, Hector Ramirez, a figure so out of place in this world of luxury that the entire room seemed to stiffen at his arrival. His clothes were old and tattered, his hair unkempt, his shoes worn down to their soles. He carried himself with an odd mix of humility and quiet confidence, as though he had once belonged in places like this, but had long since been forgotten by them. The moment he entered, whispers spread like wildfire among the guests. A few turned away in disgust, while others shot expectant glances toward the staff, waiting for someone to remove him before he could taint the air with his presence. Marcus, who had been surveying the dining room from the bar, narrowed his eyes. He despised situations like this. A homeless man wandering in, thinking he could loiter in a place like the Grand Pearl. It was bad for business. He glanced toward the host's stand, expecting his staff to handle it, but to his irritation, no one made a move. Then, before he could intervene, Ammani stepped forward. She approached Hector, her expression neutral, her voice calm. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Grand Pearl. Would you like a table for one?" The murmur of disbelief from the other staff was almost audible. Marcus clenched his jaw. This was exactly why he couldn't stand Ammani. She was too soft, too willing to offer kindness where it wasn't deserved. Hector, for his part, seemed pleasantly surprised. "Yes," he said, his voice deep and steady, as though he hadn't just been treated like an outcast by half the room. "That would be nice." Ammani led him to a small table near the back, away from the VIP section, but not so far as to seem like she was trying to hide him. As she handed him a menu, Marcus stormed over, his forced smile barely concealing his irritation. "Ammani, a word." She turned to face him, her shoulders straight. "Yes, Mr. Blake?" Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice but ensuring his tone carried the weight of a warning. "We don't serve his kind here," he said through clenched teeth. Ammani's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression neutral. "He's a paying customer, isn't he?" Marcus scoffed. "You think he has money?" He cast a disdainful glance at Hector, who had begun studying the menu with quiet interest. Be real, Johnson. People like him come in here to beg, not to buy. Do not waste my time with this nonsense. Ammani met his gaze with a quiet defiance. If he orders and pays, he's a customer like anyone else. Marcus exhaled sharply, clearly aggravated but unwilling to cause a scene in front of the guests. Fine, he spat. But if he causes trouble, he's your problem. With that, he stalked off, muttering something under his breath about wasting time on nobodies. Ammani turned back to Hector and gave him a polite smile. Can I get you something to drink? A glass of water would be nice, Hector said, a knowing gleam in his eyes. As Ammani moved to fetch it, she could feel the stares, the silent judgment radiating from the other staff, the way some of her colleagues whispered among themselves. But she ignored them. This was her job, to serve, without bias, without cruelty. And if that made her an outsider in this place, then so be it. Hector took his time with the menu, his fingers running over the edges of the laminated pages, his eyes flicking between the options. When Ammani returned with his water, he offered a small smile. I think I'll have the soup of the day and some bread, he said. Nothing too fancy. Ammani nodded. Good choice. Would you like anything else? Hector considered for a moment before shaking his head. No, that should be enough. Thank you. As she left to place the order, Marcus shot her a smug look from across the room. Let's see how this plays out, his expression seemed to say. Let's see how long your little act of charity lasts before he embarrasses himself. But Ammani didn't care what Marcus thought. She had seen plenty of people come and go in this restaurant, plenty of rich men who treated the staff like dirt, plenty of people with money but no humanity. And yet here was a man, dressed in rags, carrying himself with more dignity than half the so-called elite who dined here. She didn't know who Hector Ramirez really was. But something told her this night was about to change everything. As the night unfolded, the Grand Pearl carried on with its usual rhythm. Servers glided between tables, balancing trays of extravagant dishes, glasses clinked as wealthy patrons toasted to their successes, oblivious to the struggles of those who served them. Amidst the polished elegance of the restaurant, Hector Ramirez sat quietly at his table, his demeanor unbothered by the curious glances and hushed murmurs directed his way. He sipped his water slowly, his weathered hands resting lightly on the table, waiting patiently as if he had all the time in the world. From across the room, Marcus Blake kept a watchful eye on him, his lip curling in disdain every time his gaze landed on the man's tattered clothing. He had been in this business long enough to recognize trouble when he saw it, and in his mind, Hector was nothing more than a nuisance, a stray who had wandered in, hoping for a free meal. He had no intention of letting the night end with this man making a fool of his establishment. If Ammani wanted to waste her time serving him, fine. But the moment Hector so much as hinted that he couldn't pay, Marcus would make sure he was thrown out onto the curb where he belonged. Ammani, on the other hand, was focused on doing her job. She moved efficiently, slipping in and out of the kitchen, making sure Hector's order was prepared with the same care as any other guest's. When the chef handed her the bowl of steaming soup and a small plate of freshly baked bread, she took a moment to steady herself. She knew what everyone was thinking, that she was wasting her energy on a man who wouldn't even be able to cover his bill. But Ammani had always believed that dignity wasn't something you earned with wealth, it was something you deserved simply by being human. And tonight, no matter what anyone else thought, she would make sure Hector was treated with dignity. Returning to his table, she set the meal down carefully. Here you go, sir. Our soup of the day, potato leek, and some warm bread to go with it. Let me know if you need anything else. Hector looked up at her, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, he smiled. Thank you, young lady. This looks wonderful. Ammani gave him a small nod before stepping back, allowing him to eat in peace. She had seen enough guests in this restaurant to know the difference between those who ate mindlessly and those who truly savored their meals. Hector was the latter. He took his time with each spoonful, his eyes closing slightly, as if memorizing the flavors. He ate with a patience that was rare in a place like this, where customers were used to indulgence rather than appreciation. She was clearing a nearby table when she heard a sharp voice cut through the air. Are we really letting this happen? Ammani turned in time to see one of the regulars, an older woman draped in expensive jewelry, gesturing toward Hector with a look of distaste. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but her voice carried, ensuring the entire room could hear her displeasure. I spend thousands of dollars in this restaurant every year, and now we're just letting anyone in off the street. Ammani's hands tightened around the empty plate she was holding. Another man chimed in, his voice dripping with amusement. Next thing you know, we'll have beggars lined up outside, expecting filet mignon on the house. A few guests chuckled. Marcus, sensing an opportunity to put an end to this charade, straightened his tie and strode toward the table. I completely understand your concerns, he said smoothly, flashing a placating smile. I assure you, the Grand Pearl maintains the highest standards. I'll personally make sure this situation is handled. He turned to Hector, his expression shifting from polite professionalism to thinly veiled hostility. Sir, I trust you're enjoying your meal. Hector, who had been unbothered by the conversation up until this point, looked up from his soup, his expression neutral. Very much so. The soup is excellent. Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm glad to hear that. Now I assume you have the means to pay for it. Hector wiped the corners of his mouth with his napkin, taking his time before responding. Of course, he said simply, reaching into his pocket. For a brief moment, the restaurant seemed to collectively hold its breath. Even Ammani, who had been standing a few feet away, felt an uneasy tension creep into her chest. Hector pulled out a handful of small bills and loose change, carefully counting them out on the table. $1 here, a few quarters there, a crumpled 5. Slowly, methodically, he arranged the coins and bills into a neat little pile. Then he exhaled, looking at the amount with a quiet understanding. I seem to be a little short, he admitted, his voice calm, almost amused. I thought I had enough, but I must have miscalculated. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus let out a sharp, triumphant breath, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for. I knew it, he sneered. This is exactly why we don't allow. I'd be happy to work for it, Hector interrupted, his tone composed. Perhaps I can wash dishes in the back. I don't mind a little hard work. Marcus barked out a laugh. Oh, please. You think I'm going to let you linger in my kitchen, getting in the way of my staff? He turned toward the host's stand and snapped his fingers. Security. Ammani's stomach dropped. 2 men in black suits began moving toward Hector's table. Ammani knew them well. The Grand Pearl didn't just hire security for show. These men were trained to remove problems as efficiently as possible, no questions asked. Hold on, she said quickly, stepping forward before they could get any closer. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire behind it. He's not trying to run out on the bill. He's offering to pay it back with work. Marcus shot her a sharp look. And I said we don't run a charity. Ammani reached into the pocket of her apron, her fingers brushing against the small bundle of tips she had collected throughout the evening. It wasn't much, certainly not enough to cover the kind of extravagant meals the restaurant usually served. But tonight, it wasn't about extravagance. It was about $5. Before she could overthink it, she pulled out the money and placed it on the table next to Hector's coins. There, bills covered. A hush fell over the restaurant. Marcus's eyes darkened. You're seriously paying for him? Ammani met his gaze without hesitation. Yes. Hector looked at her, something unreadable flickering across his expression. Then, slowly, he nodded. Much appreciated. For a long moment, Marcus just stood there, jaw clenched, his pride visibly battling against the reality that there was nothing he could do. With the bill settled, he had no excuse to throw Hector out, at least, not without making a scene that would tarnish his image instead of Hector's. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, he waved off the security guards. Fine, he muttered. But don't let me see this happen again, Johnson. Ammani said nothing. She simply picked up the empty soup bowl and walked away. As Hector stood up to leave, he turned to Ammani one last time. You didn't have to do that. She shrugged, offering a small, tired smile. I know. Hector studied her for a moment, then nodded. You have a good heart, he said softly. And good hearts are rare in places like this. Then, without another word, he walked out of the Grand Pearl and disappeared into the night. Ammani exhaled, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She didn't know why she had done it. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was because, in a restaurant where wealth was everything, she had just wanted to prove that money wasn't the only thing that mattered. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this wasn't the last she would see of Hector Ramirez. Not by a long shot. The next morning, the Grand Pearl opened its doors as it always did, welcoming the city's elite into its gleaming interior. The same expensive perfumes mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The same polished floors reflected the chandeliers above, and the same carefully curated atmosphere of exclusivity hung in the air. To an outsider, it was just another day of refined luxury. But for Ammani Johnson, the weight of the previous night still lingered. She had expected the consequences. She had known the moment she placed those $5 on Hector's table that Marcus wouldn't let it slide. And she had been right. "Johnson." Marcus's voice cut through the quiet lull of the early shift, sharp and impatient. Ammani had been setting up a table near the back of the restaurant, but she straightened immediately, turning to face him. He was standing by the bar, arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression unreadable but his posture stiff with irritation. "Follow me." "May." She didn't argue. He led her through the restaurant, past the neatly dressed waitstaff preparing for the lunch rush, past the gleaming kitchen doors where chefs were already busy at work. She had assumed he was taking her to his office, but instead he stopped just outside the employee break room, a place meant for stolen moments of rest that never lasted long enough. He turned to face her, his cold, assessing eyes locking onto hers. "Do you know how much damage you caused last night?" Ammani blinked, her hands tightening at her sides. "Damage?" Marcus scoffed. "That little stunt of yours, paying for that bum's meal, do you have any idea how that makes this restaurant look? We cater to high-class clientele, Johnson. People who come here to escape reality, not be reminded that vagrants exist." Ammani's jaw clenched. He wasn't asking for a free meal. He was willing to work for it. "And I don't run a damn soup kitchen," Marcus snapped. "You think those people who were complaining last night didn't notice? You think word won't spread that the Grand Pearl is suddenly the kind of place that lets in strays? You embarrassed this restaurant. You embarrassed me." Ammani swallowed back the frustration rising in her chest. "I covered his bill. There was no reason to throw him out." Marcus let out a low, humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I don't care about $5. What I care about is the kind of people we allow in here. And I am not going to let you turn this place into some charity project. You work for me, Johnson. You do not make decisions about who belongs here." Ammani felt her nails dig into her palms, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had been through this before, though maybe not this explicitly. Marcus had never needed to say it outright. His actions, his tone, his expectations had always made it clear what kind of people he valued and what kind he wanted nowhere near his restaurant. And someone like her, a young black woman who had to fight for every inch of respect in this place, she knew better than to believe she was exempt. Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple, as if speaking to her was exhausting. "Since you seem to have so much free time to concern yourself with people who don't matter, I've decided to adjust your responsibilities." Ammani stiffened. "From now on," Marcus continued, his smirk returning, "you'll be handling additional cleaning duties. Bathrooms, floors, tables. I want everything spotless." Ammani knew exactly what this was. A punishment. A way to humiliate her, to remind her of her place. She forced her expression to remain neutral. "That's not my job." Marcus tilted his head, feigning confusion. "Oh? I could have sworn I was the one who decided what is and isn't your job." Ammani's stomach twisted, but she said nothing. "Glad we understand each other," Marcus said smoothly, stepping back. "Now get to work." Ammani turned sharply on her heel, leaving before he could say anything else. The anger simmered just beneath her skin, hot and pulsing, but she buried it deep, just as she had so many times before. She needed this job. She needed this paycheck. For her mother. So she swallowed her pride, grabbed a bucket of cleaning supplies, and got to work. By midday, her uniform was damp with sweat, her hands raw from scrubbing tile floors, and her legs sore from hours of bending, lifting, and wiping down every surface Marcus deemed unworthy of imperfection. The scent of bleach clung to her skin, a stark contrast to the rich aromas of roasted lamb and buttered lobster wafting from the kitchen. While the other servers bustled about, catering to the elite, Ammani remained in the background, invisible, just as Marcus wanted. She had spent the morning silently enduring it all, his smug glances, the way her co-workers whispered behind her back, the occasional patron who sneered when they saw her kneeling on the floor with a rag in hand. It wasn't the work that humiliated her. She had never been above cleaning. It was the intent behind it, the deliberate way Marcus had wielded this punishment to remind her that she was disposable. That kindness was weakness, that she had no power here. But even Marcus didn't know Ammani as well as he thought he did. She wasn't weak. She was just waiting for an opportunity to prove it. She had just finished emptying a trash bin near the back entrance when she heard footsteps approaching. At first, she thought it was another staff member, maybe even Marcus coming to find another excuse to berate her. But when she turned, she froze. Hector Ramirez stood before her once again. This time he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, Elena Ramirez, though Ammani didn't know her name yet. She was younger than Hector, her features sharp and striking, her posture upright and composed despite the way her clothes, simple, slightly wrinkled, suggested she hadn't had the comfort of a good night's rest. Though she wasn't as visibly worn as Hector, there was something about her presence that carried the same quiet resilience, the same unspoken weight of experience. They both looked hungry. Ammani's chest tightened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, glancing toward the doorway to make sure no one had seen them. Hector smiled, the same knowing, unbothered smile he had given her the night before. "Would you believe me if I said we were just passing through?" Ammani gave him a look, unimpressed. Elena sighed. "We haven't eaten since yesterday." Ammani's stomach sank. She had thought Hector's situation was bad enough, but the idea that his sister was also struggling made it worse. Hector chuckled at her expression. "Don't look so guilty, Miss Johnson. You already did enough for me yesterday." But Ammani didn't see it that way. Her fingers tightened around the trash bag she had been holding. If Marcus caught her talking to them, she knew what would happen. But she also knew what it felt like to go without food, to watch someone you love suffer because you didn't have enough. She thought of her mother, of the night she had skipped meals just to make sure there was more left for her. Ammani exhaled sharply, made her decision, and acted before she could talk herself out of it. "Wait here." She disappeared through the side entrance, slipping into the back kitchen, careful to avoid any wandering eyes. She knew this place like the back of her hand, where leftovers were stored before they were thrown out, which containers were set aside for employee meals, which stations were empty long enough for her to move unnoticed. She grabbed a cloth napkin, and one swift motion, scooped up a few slices of bread, a portion of roasted chicken that had been plated but never served, and a small container of mashed potatoes. It wasn't much, but it was something. She wrapped the food carefully, clutching it tight against her chest as she hurried back outside. Hector raised an amused brow when she thrust the bundle into his hands. "Quick hands, Miss Johnson. You sure you're in the right line of work?" Ammani huffed. "Just eat before someone sees you." Elena didn't hesitate. She unwrapped the bread first, breaking off a piece and handing it to Hector before taking one for herself. They ate quickly but not desperately, as though they had learned long ago how to pace themselves even when food was scarce. Ammani watched them for a moment, that familiar tightness in her chest returning. She was about to speak when a voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "What the hell is going on here?" "Marcus." Ammani turned so fast she nearly lost her balance. Marcus stood in the doorway, his expression twisted in fury, his arms crossed over his chest. His gaze flicked between Ammani and the half-eaten food in Hector's hands, and the realization dawned on him instantly. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." Ammani scrambled for words, but Marcus was already moving, stepping forward with slow, deliberate intent. "I knew it," he seethed. "I knew you were a bleeding heart, but this—" He gestured at Hector and Elena with disgust. "Stealing from my kitchen to feed a couple of beggars." Ammani's heart pounded. It was going to be thrown out. "I don't care," Marcus snapped. That's not the point. You don't get to make those decisions. You don't get to take my food and hand it out like some charity worker." He was livid. And then the words came that Ammani had been dreading. "You're fired." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Ammani had prepared for this possibility. She had known she was already on thin ice, that Marcus had been looking for a reason to get rid of her ever since last night. But still, the finality of it hit like a punch to the ribs. She opened her mouth to argue, to plead, not for herself, but for her mother, for the job that kept them afloat. But before she could get a word out, Hector moved. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a neatly folded stack of bills, and placed them directly into Marcus's hand. The entire world seemed to still. Ammani froze. Marcus looked down at the money, brows furrowing. "What the hell is this?" Hector smiled. Not the warm, knowing smile from before, but something sharper, more deliberate. "Payment," he said simply. Marcus's scowl deepened. "For what?" Hector tucked his hands into his coat pockets. "For the food, and for the lesson you're about to learn." Marcus let out a short, incredulous laugh, glancing between Ammani and Hector. "Oh, this is rich. You've got this guy paying your debts now, Johnson. You think that's going to save your job?" Hector tilted his head slightly, as if studying Marcus like an experiment whose outcome he already knew. Then, after a long pause, he said something that sent a chill through the air. "Who said anything about saving her job?" There was something final in his tone, something almost amused. Ammani didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. But she would. For a moment, Marcus just stood there, staring at the crisp stack of bills in his hand, as if trying to process what had just happened. His fingers twitched, his jaw clenched, and for the first time that evening, he seemed at a loss for words. The anger that had flared so violently just moments ago had dimmed, not because he had suddenly grown a conscience, but because money always had a way of shutting him up. Ammani could see it in his face, in the way his mind worked behind narrowed eyes. Hector had just handed him far more than the cost of a few scraps of food. Marcus had won, at least in his own mind. He had gotten what he wanted, money in his pocket. Proof that he was right about people like Hector being beneath him. And with that, his interest in punishing Ammani any further seemed to wane. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head in mock amusement before stuffing the money into his pocket. "Fine," he muttered. "I don't have time for this nonsense anyway." He flicked his gaze toward Ammani, lips curling into a smirk. "But you're still on cleaning duty. You want to play the hero, Johnson. Be my guest. But don't expect any sympathy when you realize none of it was worth it." Ammani didn't respond. She watched as Marcus turned on his heel and walked back inside, his posture that of a man who thought he had won. And maybe, to him, he had. But as Ammani turned back toward Hector and Elena, there was something in Hector's eyes, something knowing, something almost amused, that made her wonder if Marcus had just made the biggest mistake of his life. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you didn't have to do that." Hector smiled, a slow, deliberate thing. "I know." Elena studied Ammani for a long moment before stepping closer. "We'll see you again," she said, her voice calm, steady, not a question. A statement. Ammani frowned slightly, confused by the certainty in her tone, but before she could ask what she meant, Hector turned toward the alleyway. Elena followed. Within moments they had disappeared into the night. The next evening, the Grand Pearl was at its peak. The dinner rush had begun, and the restaurant hummed with the usual air of exclusivity, glasses clinking, hushed conversations, the low murmur of jazz playing beneath the sounds of indulgence. Every table was occupied by the city's elite, each guest draped in designer fabrics, their laughter laced with the easy arrogance of those who had never known hunger. The wait staff moved in a well-rehearsed rhythm, delivering plated perfection with forced smiles, while Marcus Blake stood near the bar, watching over his kingdom with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had barely thought about Ammani since yesterday. She had been a nuisance, nothing more. A bleeding heart in a business that required detachment. Letting her go had been inevitable, and though he had enjoyed seeing the shock on her face when he fired her, she was nothing but a footnote now. Employees came and went. He would replace her by the end of the week. Tonight was about business, about profit, about ensuring that the Grand Pearl remained what it had always been, a place for people who mattered. Then the doors opened. Marcus barely glanced up at first. Patrons arrived every few minutes, always dressed in their finest, always ready to spend. But something in the air shifted. A ripple of curiosity spread through the restaurant. Heads turned, conversations faltered, the room's attention slowly converging toward the entrance as if something, or someone, had tilted the balance of the room. Marcus frowned, straightening, finally looking toward the entrance. And then, his breath caught in his throat. Hector Ramirez had returned. But he was no longer the man Marcus had thrown out yesterday. Gone were the tattered clothes, the worn shoes, the quiet presence of a man who had been overlooked. In his place stood a figure of power, of wealth, of undeniable authority. Hector walked into the Grand Pearl with the confidence of a man who owned the very ground he stepped on. His suit was flawless, tailored to perfection, a deep charcoal that complemented the sleek timepiece on his wrist. His hair was neatly styled, his posture relaxed yet commanding. The very same guests who had sneered at him the night before now watched him with interest, with recognition, with the quiet unease that came when the rules of their world suddenly shifted. And beside him, equally composed, equally refined, was Elena Ramirez. She was breathtaking in an elegant black dress, her sharp features framed by a confidence that was almost royal. Where Hector exuded a quiet dominance, Elena carried the unmistakable poise of a woman accustomed to walking into rooms and owning them. The murmurs in the restaurant grew louder. A few patrons leaned toward their companions, whispering questions. Who are they? I swear I've seen him before. Wait, that's Hector Ramirez, the investor, the one behind. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Hector Ramirez. The name hit like a slap. Marcus had heard it before. Everyone in the industry had. Hector Ramirez wasn't just rich, he was powerful. A businessman whose investments stretched across continents. A man whose portfolio included hotels, resorts, and most importantly, some of the most successful fine dining establishments in the world. And he had walked into Marcus's restaurant last night, pretending to be nothing. Marcus swallowed hard, his mind racing. Why was he here? Before he could move, Hector's gaze swept across the room and landed directly on him. Marcus stiffened. Then, to his absolute horror, Hector smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was deliberate. He started walking. Every step was unhurried, measured, purposeful. Elena followed. And, as if the night hadn't already taken a turn Marcus couldn't control, he noticed that Hector wasn't just walking toward him. He was walking toward Ammani. Marcus's stomach dropped. She was here. She had been standing near the back of the restaurant, where she had been helping a junior server clear plates, a job Marcus had relegated her before he fired her, just to humiliate her one last time. She still wore her uniform, but now, standing there, watching Hector and Elena approach, she looked like she belonged more than Marcus ever had. Ammani's brows furrowed, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief as Hector came to a stop in front of her. Ammani, Hector said, his voice warm, familiar, as if greeting an old friend. It's good to see you. Ammani blinked. She hesitated, glancing between him and Elena. You, what's going on? Elena smiled. We didn't get a proper chance to introduce ourselves yesterday, she said smoothly. I'm Elena Ramirez, and this is my brother Hector. Ammani stared at them. Your brother? Hector chuckled. Surprised? That's an understatement. Marcus's patience snapped. All right, what the hell is this? Hector turned to face him, his expression unreadable. Marcus forced out a chuckle. So let me get this straight, you walk in here last night looking like a homeless man, I catch your little act, and now you're back, dressed like, he gestured vaguely. What? You think putting on a suit is going to impress me? Hector tilted his head slightly. No, but my offer might. Marcus's smirk faltered. Offer? Hector's gaze didn't waver. I'm buying this restaurant. The room went silent. Marcus stared. Then he barked out a laugh. That's the biggest load of bullshit I've ever heard. Elena raised a brow. Is it? Marcus's laugh died in his throat. Because she was holding something now. A file. She opened it with the precision of someone who had already won the game before the opponent even realized they were playing. "The Grand Pearl," she said, skimming the documents. "Privately owned by Marcus Blake, but with substantial financial backing from external investors." She flipped a page. "Investors who, as of this morning, have accepted our buyout proposal." Marcus's face drained of color. Elena snapped the file shut. "So congratulations, Marcus." She smiled, sharp and merciless. "You don't work here anymore." Marcus couldn't breathe. He looked at Hector, at the calm, steady way he watched him, like he had been waiting for this moment. "You planned this," Marcus whispered. Hector smiled. "Of course." A beat of silence. Then Marcus lost it. He turned on Ammani, his face twisted with rage. "This is your fault," he spat. "You think you're some kind of hero. You think these people actually give a damn about you." Ammani didn't flinch. She just looked at him. Calm. Unbothered. Then she said, simply, "You should go." Marcus clenched his jaw so tightly it looked painful. But he had no choice. With a final glare, he stormed toward the doors and disappeared into the night, leaving behind the restaurant that was no longer his. The moment he was gone, Hector exhaled, then turned back to Ammani. "So," he said, smiling, "how do you feel about running this place?" Ammani stared at him. Then, slowly, she smiled back. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.